This Film is Lit, the podcast where we finally settle the score on one simple question. Is the book really better than the movie? I'm Brian, and I have a film degree, so I watch the movie, but don't read the book.
And I'm Katie. I have an English degree, so I do things the right way and read the book before we watch the movie.
So prepare to be wowed by our expertise and charm as we dissect all of your favorite film adaptations and decide if the silver screen or the written word did it better. So turn it up, settle in, and get ready for spoilers, because this film is lit. The daughter of a legendary thief who sewed winter coats out of stolen purses. Herself a thief, pickpocket, swindler. The savior who came to tear my life apart. My Tamako, my Sookee. It's the Handmaiden, and this film is lit. Hello and welcome back to This Film is Lit, the podcast where we talk about movies that are based on books or loosely inspired by in this instance. We'll see. We'll get into it.
Yeah.
We're going to get right.
Whether or not it's based on or inspired by, I think, is debatable, but we'll get into it.
Which is something we mentioned in our prequel episode, which you can go check out if you haven't listened to it. We have a lot to get to, including a very lengthy Let Me Sum Up section. So if you haven't seen the movie, it is available on Amazon Prime, but if you haven't watched it, highly recommend it. Great movie. Go watch it if you're into this kind of thing. Do some reading about it first before you do. It's got a lot of traumatizing type of stuff in it if you're easy, if that's not something you're into. So do a little bit of reading to make sure. But otherwise, very good movie. Highly recommend it. Go watch it on Amazon Prime if you're in the US. If not, we're going to sum it up very, very not briefly. So let's do that now.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
This is the longest Let Me Sum Up I have ever written for this podcast. All right, so Fingersmith, the book. Sue Trinder has grown up in the borough in London and at Mrs. Suxby's house among thieves and criminals, but Mrs. Suxby treats her as a daughter. A family friend that they call Gentleman arrives with a proposition for her. Travel out to the countryside and pretend to be a lady's maid to a woman named Maud Lily, who is set to inherit a fortune. The plan is for Gentleman to marry her and then put her in a madhouse so he can take her fortune, giving a cut to Sue. Sue agrees and travels to Briar House, where Maud lives with her old uncle. Briar is a strange, cold place, but Sue and Maud eventually grow fond of each other, culminating in them falling in love and being intimate together. Sue grows hesitant of the plan, but cannot see a way out of it. She helps Gentleman talk Maud into escaping, after which they are married. However, when they arrive at the asylum, the pair pass off Susan as Maud and she is imprisoned. Part 2 cuts to Maud's perspective, where it is revealed that she knew the entire plan as well as Gentleman's plot to swap the two at the madhouse. She has also fallen for Sue, but similarly cannot see a way out of the plot that also frees her of her uncle, who controls and sexually abuses her. However, after leaving Sue and arriving in London, she finds herself imprisoned at Mrs. Suxby's house. She then learns that 17 years ago, a lady arrived at Mrs. Suxby's house pregnant and hiding from her father and brother. The lady begged Mrs. Suxby to help her by switching her baby for another. She amends her will so that both babies will receive a share of her inheritance. Mrs. Suxby's baby, named Maud, goes with the lady as she's dragged away by her father and brother. The lady's baby, Susan, remains with Mrs. Suxby. Both girls are raised ignorant of their true births until Mrs. Suxby brought Gentleman in to put the plot in motion. With Maud under her care and Susan trapped in the madhouse, Mrs. Suxby is set to inherit the entire fortune. Meanwhile, in part 3, we catch up with Susan, who is being treated horribly at the madhouse. Susan manages to escape and make her way back to London. When she confronts everyone at the house, she can't understand why Mrs. Suxby is intent on protecting Maud. Gentleman arrives at the worst possible moment and in a scuffle is stabbed and bleeds out from his wounds. When the police arrive, Mrs. Suxby, feeling guilty for how she used and treated both of her daughters, confesses to the crime and is hanged. Sue finds the will among her things and learns of her and Maud's true parentage. She sets out to find Maud after realizing that on the night Gentleman was stabbed, Maud was trying to protect her from learning the terrible truth of her adoptive mother. She finds that Maud has returned to Briar following the uncle's death and is now supporting herself by writing erotica. The two reconcile and the book closes with them kissing and Maud showing Susan how she's written down all the words for how I want you. The end.
All right, and the movie. Here's a brief summary. Sookee is a young Korean woman selected to travel to Lady Hideko, a Japanese heiress, to serve as her handmaiden. We quickly learn that Sookee is in fact a common pickpocket planted by a con man named Count Fujiwara, who plans to use Sookee to encourage Lady Hideko to marry him. He will then have Hideko committed to an asylum and steal her family fortune. Upon arriving at Hideko's estate, Sookee is immediately smitten with Hideko, but continues with her plan to help Fujiwara. Hideko lives with her mysterious uncle who uses his wealth to feed his obsession with rare books. Sookee continues to encourage Hideko to marry Fujiwara, but the two end up falling for each other and eventually making love. Sookee, wildly conflicted at this point, helps Fujiwara elope with Hideko to Japan, where after securing the family fortune, they take Hideko to an asylum to be committed, but upon arriving at the asylum, it is revealed that Hideko was in fact in on the plot the whole time, and she and Fujiwara double-cross Sookee, who is then committed in the asylum in place of Hideko. We then flash back in the story to examine Hideko's upbringing, chronicling the sexual and physical abuse she suffered at the hands of her uncle. It becomes clear that Hideko's apparent naivete that we saw with Sookee was all an act, as Fujiwara has included her in the plan from almost the very beginning. Hideko demands, while planning, that they find a girl who can be committed to the asylum in her place to keep her abusive uncle from tracking her down and torturing her in his evil basement. We then revisit many of the scenes from the beginning of the film and watch Hideko fall in love with Sookee despite her ultimate plans of betrayal. After Sookee tries to convince Hideko to marry Fujiwara, Hideko attempts to hang herself but is saved by Sookee. The two then confess their roles in the plot to each other, realizing they were both playing each other, and then hatch a plan together to escape the men who have been manipulating them. Hideko shows Sookee the library full of pornography that her uncle used to abuse her as a child, and Sookee destroys it all in a fit of rage. Hideko joins her in that act. Back now in the asylum, kind of flashing forward, back now in the asylum, a fire breaks out, and Sookee, with the help of one of her friends from her criminal life, escapes. Meanwhile, Hideko drugs Fujiwara, absconds with the money that they had stolen from her family, and Hideko and Sookee reunite and flee together on a ship. Fujiwara is then captured by the evil uncle and tortured in his basement before ultimately killing both the uncle and himself with mercury-laced cigarettes. The evil men are dead, and our happy couple sail into the literal sunset, making love. The end. That's it.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. I've left out a couple things, but overall, more detailed than I would normally go, because I think you need... I don't know how many people have watched this one necessarily, and I think you need a lot of background. Also, I kind of alluded to it already, but there will be just kind of a content warning. We won't go into graphic detail or anything, but there will be discussions of like sexual violence and that sort of stuff, because that is a recurring theme within this story. So if that's something you're not into, you might want to skip this one. Or when I say not into, something you don't want to hear, you may want to skip this one. Again, we're not going to go into explicit detail or anything, but the movie doesn't go into explicit detail, but it is a topic, so we will be discussing it. All right, we got a lot to get to, and I have some questions, so let's find out what's in the book.
Nicholas Flamel is the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone.
The what?
Honestly, don't you two read?
So, we were introduced to our two main characters, and at the beginning of the story, Sookee in the movie, and we're going to generally use probably the movie's names for these characters. Well, I will use the movie's names for these characters, at least mostly. All my questions, I use the movie's characters' names because I didn't know the the non-movie characters' names. But Katie will at times use both, and we'll try to make it clear who we're talking about.
I'll try to make it as clear as possible.
Yes. And there's a dynamic. This story in the film takes place in the colonial rule period of Japan, sort of colonial's rule in Korea. And Sookee is a Korean woman who goes to work at the estate of a Japanese lady. And I was wondering if there's a similar dynamic, like a similar political dynamic of that nature between our two, or any similar in the dynamics between our two main characters in the book that there is in the movie.
It's a similar setup. There's like basically like a low-born girl traveling to be lady's maid to a high-born girl. The book takes place in Victoria-era London, so there's not as much of a political dynamic as there is in the movie. I mean, there's a bit of like a social class structure
there's class
dynamic,
dynamics, but less. There's
but
not
less so the like colonial rule dynamic.
Yeah, so the movie added an extra layer of political sort of, like you said, an extra political dynamic by having one of them be Korean during this time and one of the other one be Japanese. So we get kind of a double layer there. There's a little scene early on when we're introduced to Sookee and her, like when the flashbacks, or as were explained to us, that she is like a pickpocket and lives with like a family of, you know, criminals or whatever. And they seem to like raise and sell babies or something like that. And she has a line where she says that she can't produce milk and she seems very upset about it. And I was wondering if that is a little detail from the book or what it means. I mean, obviously there's some, you can imply some sort of thematic ideas about like her tying her femininity or her like worth to the ability to like be a mother or whatever. And I think that's kind of what and like traditional gender roles and like what expectations society foists upon her, I think is kind of what we're going for.
I think that's what we're meant to get from it.
I wonder if that came from the book. Or
it's not something that I recall from the book. They do like the house that she grows up in is an infant farm. Is what they call it in the book.
I wonder if that's.
I'm assuming I'm assuming it is this book, and obviously, like that's not an area of expertise for me. But this book feels incredibly like well researched and like very ensconced in its time period and setting. But yeah, they basically like Mrs. Suxby, who is the older woman who runs the house, which we see her like her equivalent character in the movie, but we don't really spend time with her or know much about her. But it basically like procures babies and then sells them to people who are looking for babies.
Interesting. This movie does end up being a lot, I think ultimately a lot about, I mean, its primary sort of thematic through line is about women sort of throwing off their chains of oppression and that sort of thing. And sort of, again, freeing themselves from sort of patriarchal expectations and patriarchal abuse and that sort of things. And so I think this is just a beginning little thematic pin in that to kind of set up where she's coming from. But it sounds like that's not as much. Would you say it's a similar thematic, and we'll get there more in the end, but like, would you say thematically the stories are saying similar things in that regard?
Similar, yes.
Okay. So the movie reveals this maybe earlier than I was expecting, which is why I asked about it, is that so we open with Sookee, we don't know anything about her, and we watch her go to this big estate, and sort of we're jump right in with her arriving and taking on the jobs of handmaiden to Lady Hideko. But then very quickly, within the first 10 minutes or so, we sort of jump back, and it is revealed to us that she's a plant, and the whole plan that we think at the time, the whole plan of Count Fujiwara trying to, like, their whole scam is revealed to us very early in the movie. Again, what we think is the whole scam is revealed to us very early in the film. And I wanted to know if the book does the same thing, because I was expecting that to come later. Now, obviously, there are a lot more twists and turns in the movie that go other places, so they kind of had to get that one going early to set up where we go the rest of the way. But does the book do it like that, or?
So the book starts with Sue in London, so we know she's a fake right from the beginning.
Let's do this real quick. Sookee is Sue.
Yes.
And Hideko
is Maud.
Okay. So it starts basically
it starts
setting up
the
scam.
Scene where Count Fujiwara comes to the house.
And is like, I got this idea.
And he's like, oh, there's this scam I'm going to run and I need help with it. That's where the book opens.
So the movie, that scene comes like 10 minutes in or whatever, whereas in the book, that's like the first scene. Okay. So once she gets to the house, at one point she's kind of exploring the house, and she ends up in the library. She opens the door to the library, and she starts to walk in, and the uncle, this is our first interaction with him, Hideko's uncle, and I can't remember his actual name. I just call him Uncle or the Uncle all the time in my notes. So it's Hideko's uncle. He like yells at Sookee not to come any further. He says, "The snake," and she looks down, and at first I thought it was a real snake.
Yeah.
Like the way it's cut and shot, like they don't show it very long, and I thought it was a real snake, but it's a statue of a snake that's like sitting on the floor, and he says, the snake marks the bounds of knowledge or something like that, and she stops right there, and then they kind of force her out and like shut the door on her or whatever, and she's not allowed into the library. And I wanted to know if there was like a secret library, not a secret library, but like an off limits library and a snake statue.
Yes, the library is one of the primary settings in the book. It's not a snake in the book, but there's a huge brass hand that's embedded in the floor. But the idea is the same. The uncle doesn't want any of the servants to come in past that hand because they aren't good enough to be near the books.
Does her uncle look evil? Because in the movie, he's constantly like writing or something, and he's using ink, and he like licks the brush, I guess, and so his tongue is just black all the time.
His whole mouth is black.
And apart from that, he just looks evil. Like they did a very good job making him. He's got like
eyebrows.
He's got villain eyebrows, to be real. Yeah, he's got villain eyebrows, but like anime villain eyebrows. But I did think it was. I wanted to know if he is described like similarly at all in the book.
Yeah, I think he is described at least kind of similarly to how he looks in the movie. The ink on his eye, on his mouth, and on his face is the same. Like that's also described in the book. And he's always described using like kind of unsettling language, especially about his eyes. Like he wears like little round dark glasses all the time.
Yeah.
And when he takes them off, his eyes are described as looking like kind of milky and odd looking. Like he's starting to go blind, I think is the idea. Yeah. But like the way that it interacts with the color of his eyes is very unsettling. Yeah. So it's a similar idea, I think.
I do want to briefly discuss the change from a hand on the floor to a snake or whatever, because I thought that was interesting. Obviously from like a Western, Christian background, the snake as the thing demarking the knowledge, like harkening back to the idea of the snake in the Garden of Eden from the Bible, and it being the thing that sort of I'm not a Bible scholar, but it being the thing that sort of tempts Eve with the knowledge of from the fruit of the tree of good and evil, and basically being like a gatekeeper of knowledge and being the thing that symbolizes that. But I wonder if that's what the movie is playing on, or if there's some other cultural touchstone with the snake that from Korea or Japan or whatever that the movie is playing with. Or if it is, I mean, because obviously it's not like the Bible was unknown to those, like
right, and especially at that time period.
Yeah,
too.
And even more so when they made the movie in 2016. So I think Christianity is fairly popular. Like I could be wrong about that, but I do wonder if that was the illusion, or so if you know anything about Korean like mythology or anything, or if what a snake may sort of if it represents the similar idea, like maybe that's a cultural touchstone that has passed some or moved through other culture. I don't know. I just thought that was interesting because again, to me, from a Western perspective, that's what immediately jumped to my mind, and I wanted to know if maybe that was their intention or not. So then we move forward, and we get a scene where Hideko is taking a bath, and Sookee is helping her out, and Hideko complains that her tooth is sharp, like she has like a sharp spot on her tooth that is cutting her cheek or something like that. And Sookee runs and grabs a thimble and uses it to like sand down her tooth, basically, in an incredibly romantic and erotic scene.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know if that scene takes place in the book.
So in the book, Sue does file down one of Maud's teeth with a thimble. It does not happen in the bath. They're just like standing in her room. Similarly romantic and erotic. I did enjoy that the movie gave us a bath scene because I felt like that was kind of a classic trope that the book
lady book
lacked.
Scene, kind of thing. Yeah. So that's a better in the movie scene for you. Fantastic. There's this other. So following that, there's a kind of a scene where they're like trying on clothes and stuff, and at one point, Lady Hideko is putting Sookee in a corset, and there's this like very comical shot of her like wrenching her into this corset with her foot up on her back and like tightening the strings. That is very silly, because it comes after a direct cut where she's like, she's wearing like I don't know if a bra is the right word, but something like a bra, and she's like, oh, it's so constricting, and she's like, oh, wait till you cry corset, and then it cuts to her wrenching on this corset, and I thought that was very funny, and I wanted to know if the comedic element of that scene came from the book, or if any of it, I guess, came from the book.
Definitely not the comedic element.
Okay.
There's a kind of similar idea of a scene where Maud dresses Sue, and like she dresses her up in her nice clothes, but there's not really any emphasis on the corset specifically.
Okay.
I liked that scene too, though.
I thought it was very funny. Again, just the way it's shot, like the cut, and then like her foot is just like up on her back.
And that's kind of a visual trope from like period films as well, like tightening the corset.
I feel like I've seen like a Disney movie, maybe not Disney movie, but it's like a like that image of like, the person with their foot up, like pulling on the corset laces. It reminded me of something out of a cartoon. So then we have the scene. This whole time, Count Fujiwara, who is the con man in the story, who hired Sookee, he is pretending to be a count, and he's hitting on Lady Hideko, and trying to court her in order to ultimately propose to her, so they get married and he can steal her fortune. And there's a handful of scenes of their courtship that we see in this first part. And this movie ultimately does a very interesting thing, which we'll talk about, which is show us a lot of these scenes from kind of multiple perspectives, which I thought was really interesting. But there's one scene in particular where I believe she's painting, and she's like practicing her painting, and he's sitting like right next to her, behind her, talking, and he's like laying on these really overwrought like pickup artisty, like, oh, you see the essence of the object. I fear to stand before you, for you may read my thoughts. And it's like just this ridiculous. And I love in the background, Sookee is listening to this, and she like gags, like when she's listening, she like retches as he's talking, which made me laugh a lot. And I wanted to know if that scene came from the book.
We do see some scenes of the equivalent character to him, like, well, what we think is him trying to court the lady.
Right.
There's no scene where she like retches, though.
Yeah, as she's listening to his terrible.
And I don't recall that there's anything equivalent to that specific line, but like the kind of overwrought pickup line kind of language. Yeah.
I think it's the same scene, or maybe a following scene. There's this moment where he's kind of hitting on her, and he grabs her, and and Hideko's like, leave me alone. And Suki's sitting in the room, and then Count Fujiwara like calls her over and gives her a coin, some money, and says, go do another job or something, with the implication, that he's gonna try to further grope Hideko, basically. And she starts to leave, but then she comes back and she gives him the coin and says, I have no other job. My only job is to look after the lady. It's a very cute, very romantic scene, and I want to know if that came from the book.
It's not from the book, but I also liked that line. Very romantic line. Mm-hmm. Adorable.
Very cute. And then we get the actual, our first, which I guess it's like the same scene twice.
Yeah.
Where they actually make love. Where they have sex, and the way it plays out, the first time we see it from the perspective of Sookee in this instance, is that Hideko is like very nervous because she's never been with it. She's been living in this house by herself her whole life. She knows nothing of the ways of the world, and she's nervous about being like intimate with Count Fujiwara. So Sookee comes in and is like, well, I can show you, I can help, or whatever. And then that she has to like show her the birds and the bees. Is that how that scene plays out? Because that is like quintessential this kind of story thing.
Yeah,
I feel like.
yes. And it's very, very similar in the book with Maud, the lady, pretending to be like wholly ignorant of what's going to happen. And then Sue having to show her what the gentleman will want to do on their wedding night. Classic
stuff. And I have this question later, but I guess I'll just do it now because I think it makes sense to talk about here because it's the scene, the explicit sex scene. So we talked about it in the prequel episode, but this movie has I would say, fairly explicit and lingering sex scenes on par with something like if you watched The Blue Is the Warmest Color, kind of similar, maybe slightly less nudity. Like it's shot more. Like I feel like there's less. It's a little bit less nudity, but
it's a little bit less.
But it's similar types of lengthy sex scenes. And I wanted to know if the book is in fact like graphic. Is it like erotica, or is that is it more like men? You know what I mean? Like how explicit is the book? I guess
I would say not as much as the movie. Like similarly, we really only get the one sex scene that we see twice from each girl's perspective. Yeah. The scene that is from Maud, the lady's perspective, was a little bit more graphic than I'd been expecting based on the first chunk of the book, and especially the first time we see that scene from Sue's perspective.
Yeah.
But it was not nearly as explicit as the movie is.
Yeah. And to be fair, the second time we see it in the movie, it's a much longer, more explicit scene than the first time. The first time we don't see, I don't know if there's any nudity in the first time we see it, and it cuts pretty quickly. We hear some moaning and it cuts
cut
pretty
away
quickly.
Much quicker.
Whereas in the second time when we revisit it, we actually spend a lot of time in that scene and see lots of things. And so, yeah, but it is more, so maybe not in the same level as the movie, but it is fairly explicit in the sense that, like you said, more so than you were kind of expecting.
Yeah.
Interesting. At one point, Count Fujiwara, this whole time, Sookee has been watching him, terribly hit on Hideko, and I say terribly hit on, and like assault, like grope her and stuff, and make her really uncomfortable. And Sookee kind of confronts him about it, and it's like you're terrible. It's like, what are you doing? You're pushing too hard, that sort of thing. And he like grabs her hand and puts it on his junk, while they're like having this conversation, because again, he's a creep. And at the they're having this big argument, and at the end of it, as she leaves, she says to him, and don't ever put my hand on your tiny joke of a cock again, or something like that. And it made me laugh a lot, and I wanted to know if that came from the book.
It's not from the book, but I did like it.
It's very good.
He deserved it.
He did. He absolutely did. I did like too that he just kind of takes it and it's just like, all right. Okay. I think his character is very interesting in this movie.
Yeah.
He's like terrible, but like not the worst person in the, like he's awful and a creep and an abuser and awful, but like slightly better than some of the other people in this movie, which I thought was interesting.
That's kind of similar to how the book is too. Yeah. Like he's not a good character, but he's also very interesting.
Yes.
And there is, I think, like a specific line in the book where he says, I think to Maud, something like, I'm a villain, but there are worse villains than me. Yeah. Your uncle is one of them.
Yes. And that's very much what we kind of come to in the movie, is that he is, while not a good person, I mean, apart from like, he's a con man or whatever, but I don't think the movie is even judging him for that. Like that doesn't feel, because again, Sookee's a pickpocket and stuff. This movie is not judging people for being criminals in a situation where their survival depends on them being criminals at all. But he is, and the movie also, I mean, once we kind of see it from the other perspective, a lot of the sleazier things he does in the movie are a show, like to some extent. That being said, it's still, you can tell he is still, like the part with him putting Sookee's hand on his junk is not a show. That's not a show for anybody. Like that scene, you know what I mean? Like that moment is not for anything, but like the points where he's like kind of making Hideko uncomfortable and stuff, they're doing that intentionally, we find out, and kind of like cooperatively ish. kind of. It's
she's uncomfortable with it, but it's not exactly what it looks like from an outside perspective.
That being said, he is still a sleazy, gross dude, but he has a little bit of honor. It's like a slight, a modicum of redeeming, ness to him, and I think that line from the book, while a little on the nose, does kind of sum it up perfectly. Is that he's a villain, but there are much worse villains than him. So there's this thing and I was wishing the movie was going to go somewhere with this or have this be, and I don't think they ever really do, but it just happens a handful of times, and I thought it was very cute, is that there's this recurring thing where, and this is all still this is all during the first part where we haven't had the big twist yet, but Sookee keeps coming across Hideko staring out the window, and when she stares out the window, she leans her head against the glass, and this happens 2 or 3 times at least throughout the movie, and so every time she comes back from or leans back away from the window, she'll have this little red circle on her forehead from leaning against the glass, and it becomes this recurring thing where Sookee keeps seeing it, and she finds it very cute, and it is one of these little things that endears Hideko to her, and I was wondering if that little detail came from the book, because I thought that was cute.
No, not really. There is a recurring thing where she's looking out of her bedroom window a lot in the book, but there's nothing about her getting a little red pressure mark on her forehead. Right.
So then we get to the big twist at the end of part 1. So the movie and the book, it sounds like, is split into 3 parts.
Yes.
Okay. And the big reveal at the end of part 1 is Hideko has agreed to marry Count Fujiwara, and they abscond to Japan. And then once there, Fujiwara and Sookee seemingly conspirate to get her thrown in an asylum so that they can take her money. And as they get to the asylum and they're getting ready to take her away, Hideko backs away, and then the doctors come out and they actually grab Sookee, and we get this big rug pull moment where they have told the doctors, the asylum or whatever, that Sookee is in fact Lady Hideko.
Yeah.
And so they pulled an old switcheroo over on Sookee, and she gets thrown into the asylum, and that's the end of part 1. And I wondered if we get that big rug pull plot twist. It comes from the book.
Yeah, it does. That's the part 1 climax, similar to in the movie. They arrive at the asylum, and we get the switcheroo, and Susan is surprised when they seize her instead of Maud.
Interesting. So we'll get there, obviously, because I have quite a few more questions. But to me, it sounds like, again, from the summary, that part 1 is similar, and then part 2 and 3 are very different.
Yeah.
Ish.
I would say that's accurate.
Okay. So it sounds like they were use the setup, and then the movie was all right, now we want to do something different from there, which is, or at least, and there are still similarities, obviously, but different elements are pulled from it. Anyways, so then we kind of jump back, and we have this flashback in the film to Hideko as a child who lives with her aunt and her uncle, and her aunt is not her uncle's wife, right? Or is it? Maybe it is.
No, it was.
It's her mom's sister.
Yeah.
But not her uncle's.
So the aunt that we meet
wife.
in the movie was his sister-in-law.
Yes. Correct. I believe that's correct. Yes. And then, there's this thing where I was a little confused by everything that was going on here, and I want to know if this comes from the book, because hoping you can give me, this is almost a lost in adaptation. Because so they do these readings of these books, which turn out, most of them or all of them, to be erotica, basically. And they do these readings for these gentlemen or whatever. And then they sell these books, but also it seems like it's maybe just a front for prostitution of some sort, potentially. Maybe it's not just a front, maybe that's just a side, part of it at the same time, because we see these scenes where once Hideko's older, where she's basically, dominatrixing these guys that are coming. But I also think they are selling the books. This whole book plot element thing, does that come from the book? And if so, can you shed any light on it? Because I found it,
okay.
I don't need a lot of the for the movie still works without me exactly understanding what's going on here, but I was just a little confused.
I can shed a little light, I think. So first off, there's no aunt character in the book, but I did like that addition. The setup here is similar. There is the backstory. Maud has this backstory that her uncle has trained her to read erotica since she was a child. And he's like obsessed with erotica.
Yes.
In the book, he collects
he is in the movie
it.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, he collects it. I think he does sell books as well, but there's like a mention of also like making forgeries of books.
Yeah, they say that in the movie
sell.
too. They sell the forgeries instead of the real thing. So because he likes to keep the real ones, so he forges them and sells forgeries. Yeah.
So Maud, Lady Hideko, is she's like his secretary, and she like copies books for him.
Yeah.
But she's also how he shows them off through the readings, and also is like a novelty plaything in that he gets off from having her read and then bringing other men there to listen to her read.
Okay.
And it's a little bit less like in the movie, what we get is like almost a dramatic reading.
It's very much like they're doing these very like dramatic readings. Well, and we'll talk about it here momentarily. It's in my next question. But yeah, it turned like there's very theatrical.
Yeah, it seems much more theatrical in the film than the vibe that I got in the book.
Okay.
The spanking like S&M scene from the movie is not something that happens in the book, and that threw me a little. Like, I wasn't sure what was going on at first in that scene because it like diverged so hard and fast from what up until that point was like very, very similar to what's in the book. Like, I felt like it came out of nowhere and then never came back.
Yeah. So I will say that I think maybe what the movie's going for there is it seems like kind of a reasonable extension of what's going on there, that maybe some of the men would pay for time with her or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think the movie is basically just using that as an extra layer to make clear the abuse that she was suffering, as opposed to like just having her read a book. Like, maybe the movie worried that it wouldn't be as clear what like the exploitation that was going on if we just see her like reading a book or something. I don't know.
I would agree with that.
And so I'm thinking maybe it's just the movie trying to make that a little more explicit.
I like it is exploitation, but I could see I could see the like somebody looking at the script and saying audiences might not understand what exactly is happening here, so we need something that's a little more explicit
obvious,
and obvious. Yeah, I think you're right.
Again, I don't, and I'm sure it ties in thematically with other things. I mean, the corporal punishment is a kind of a recurring, at least somewhat recurring. Like, there's a scene early on in the flashback where we see him like hitting, when she's very young, he's like punishing her for speaking back by like hitting her hand with some sort of metal bead bell thingies, which we'll talk about. But and so I think it's just kind of reinforcing off of that, and again, just making it a little more obvious for the audience of what is transpiring here. So I just mentioned it, but in one of these readings, we get this scene in the movie, and I'm hoping this is in the book because it's very strange, where at the end of her reading, the uncle lowers this giant they call it a puppet or a something like that, what's a marionette or a puppet in the film, but it's like this giant wood marionette dummy thing on ropes that lowers down, and she like climbs onto it and I guess somehow tied to it or something, or I don't know if the implication is stranger than that, but she's somehow attached to this dummy, and then it's hoisted into the air and like creates this like, you know, living statue, like piece of art or whatever. And it's, you know, very you know, erotic to everybody, whatever. And I didn't know if that it just kind of moves on, and I wanted to know if that came from the book because I found it very strange.
So that's not from the book, but I think the idea is that they're creating a stand-in for the missing illustration on the page that was torn out of the book. You're right,
because he does.
He shows the book and there's
a page missing, which was But that confused me because we see later on Sookee rip a page out of a book, and in my head I was like, oh, that's the book that was missing the page earlier, but that timeline doesn't make sense at all, like, because this is before Sookee ever was there. Interesting. But he does. He talks about how, okay, that's what it is. It's like This is the illustration that's there.
Yeah, because they put like a noose around the marionette's neck, which was what she was reading about, was like erotic asphyxiation.
Yes.
I cannot say that word.
Yes, exactly. Okay. That makes sense. I, for some reason, didn't put together that they were basically like physically illustrating the picture. Okay. Totally makes sense. But not in the book.
No.
Okay. So does the uncle have a horrifying torture basement that he killed the aunt in? So spoilers, there's a whole plot line that I didn't go into where the aunt eventually is driven to insanity, and they come across her hanging in a tree in their yard, seemingly having committed suicide and hung herself from watching the abuse of Hideko and that she was subjected to and all that sort of stuff. But then ultimately the uncle reveals that actually he killed the aunt and made it look like she killed herself, basically, and he murdered her in his murder basement. And I want to know if he has a murder basement.
There's no murder basement in the book. That was far darker than anything.
I will say that it is interesting that the second and third acts of this movie hit more close to what. So remember, we talked about in the prequel about how I didn't know what this movie was necessarily, and that from what I had heard, I knew it was like a erotic, like thriller-y kind of deal, but I didn't know. I also, from the poster and stuff, had assumed that it was much scarier and like darker than maybe I thought it was upon reading about it in the prequel notes. But then upon watching it, I think it is closer to my original sort of appraisal of it in terms of how dark it is and how weird and like gross and creepy you know what I mean? Like it is closer to something like a Parasite, and tonally it feels.
Yeah.
And maybe it is interesting, and I have a note about this in my odds and ends later, about tonally this movie is all over the map, but I think it works.
Yeah.
Like,
I agree.
it is tonally everywhere. Like it's very silly at times. It's very like tender and romantic at times. It's very disgusting and horrifying at times. And sometimes it does those in a span of 5 minutes. It goes from, it covers 3 of the, and it's such ups and downs. But it does feel like it does that in a way that works because, we watched the season finale of Boba Fett the other night, and we talked about how tonally it was just all over the place. And not to get into it, but it felt, in that instance, I felt like the tonal fluctuations did not work at all.
Didn't work for me either.
Whereas in this, the tonal fluctuations did. And I thought this is a very well-crafted film in lots of ways, and so you can make, you can get away with more if you're making just a gorgeous whatever. But that being said, I think it was very interesting that tonally this movie, and it did remind me a lot of Parasite because my exposure to Korean cinema is not very great. I've seen probably 4 or 5 Korean films in my lifetime, this and Parasite being one of them, and Parasite being the most recent one that we watched. And it did strike me how similar they were in terms of
it did make me wonder if, because my exposure to Korean cinema is even less than yours is. And it did make me wonder if that is maybe a hallmark of Korean cinema or recent Korean cinema.
Or it could just be that these particular directors, because they do work together at time, or they, he was Park Chan-wook, who directed this, was a producer on Bong Joon-ho's who's the other the director of Parasite. I think I said his name right. I'm just trying to remember it off the top of my head. Snowpiercer. He was a producer on that, so they may work together. Maybe they're just like
maybe or
it's more
it
like
could
their
be
style.
like a genre trope potentially. I don't know.
When you're doing like dark satirical comedy thrillers, it's just they're so similar in sort of, again, what they're how tonally they operate, and like kind of like the genre I would fit them into are very similar, which I thought was fascinating. And I'm sure there are more movies that are also sort of similarly situated, because I was trying to think, I guess the thing that I thought was really interesting, I was trying to think of a Western film that I think would fit in a similar type of,
that's like stylistically similar,
like in terms of the tone being all over the place like that. And I think some of the things that come close might be like Tarantino gets kind of like that. Like if you think of like Pulp Fiction, that movie bounces around from like horrifying sexual violence to like really silly, ridiculous scenes to like brutal, like violent, you know what I mean? Like, and a lot of his stuff, I know Tarantino is a big fan of it, like Asian media and like Chinese media and Korean films and that sort of thing. So, and I'm not trying to loop that all together, but the point being, I know like a lot of like there's one of his movies, Reservoir Dogs, from what I understand, is basically like a 1-to-1 rip of like a very famous, and I don't remember what country it's from, but they're an Asian film that he basically just like stole the plot from.
Yeah.
And made Reservoir Dogs, basically. There's a 1987 film from Hong Kong called City on Fire that many critics somewhat accused Tarantino of ripping off because apparently the final 20 minutes of both films are basically identical. And so I think Tarantino might be the closest in some of his films that I could think of, because there aren't a lot of other ones. Maybe, I mean, Del Toro at times is close, you know, like, because there is like something like Pan's Labyrinth does have a similar, you know, fantastical feel to it. And it does go from very silly, fun, fantastical elements to like very dark, horrifying scenes.
You know what? It's not the same because it's not really a tonal shift, but Get Out, I thought played with tone
that's another,
in a kind of similar way to make something that was very like kind of upsetting and put you off kilter.
Yeah, it's very viscerally upsetting, but also very I think that's a very good. And I haven't seen Us, which is Jordan Peele's second film after Get Out, or I don't know if it's the second film, but you know, kind of the spiritual successor to Get Out. I think that is a similar. Those films are definitely, I think, similar in their being like kind of thriller horror. Like black comedy, satire-y kind of things. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that was interesting. Anyways, just wanted to talk about that. Okay. So then we go back and we go through all of these scenes from the beginning. Now that we have the reveal that Lady Hideko was kind of in on this from the beginning, we go back and we revisit a lot of the scenes from the first part from her perspective, which I thought was super cool and super interesting. We kind of see the way they're both playing each other, but then we also get to watch her. Before we watched Sookee fall in love with her, now we get to watch her fall in love with Sookee. And I also thought it was really interesting kind of watching them not realize that they both like hold more and less power than they thought. Just very fascinating. I really enjoyed when it went back and we kind of went through all those scenes and seeing them from that other perspective. It's very, I thought it was interesting. And I wanted to know if we do that in the book, if we go back and see some of these scenes from a different perspective.
Yeah, we do get both of their perspectives in the book. Part 1 is Sue's perspective, and it's first person.
Oh, okay.
Part 2 from Maud, and then part 3 goes back to Sue again. And we do see, like, the book runs more linearly than the movie does. But we do, like, when we arrive at part 2 in Maud's perspective, we go back and we see a lot of what we already saw in part 1.
Cool. Interesting. And the movie, while not explicitly like first person, it does have, we do get voiceover, like narration, first person narration from each of the characters in the different parts. So I think it definitely follows the book in that regard. Yeah. And also we do get seemingly, I had a note about later, but I think it makes sense to talk about here, is that this movie occasionally, and I noticed it more in the beginning and maybe it kept it up throughout and it just trailed off, is that it uses like handheld. A lot of this movie is shot sort of locked down on tripods, on dollies, on like traditional, you know, elevated cinema style, like kind of a film shooting perspective. But occasionally, especially in the first 10 minutes, I noticed we would get these handheld shots. And they seemingly were usually from the perspective of Sookee. It seemed to be like when we were in those handheld shots, it was almost through the eyes of Sookee in those scenes. And I meant to kind of follow and see if they kept that up throughout the film and if it switched to Lady Hideko in part 2, and I don't remember. I'd have to watch it again and see.
Yeah, I don't recall. I got very caught up in the ways that the story was changing.
Yes, I got caught up in the actual story itself, and other stuff to where it kind of I wasn't as cognizant of those specific filmmaking decisions. But I would be interested to not super interested to watch this movie because it is kind of like a lot. But while very good, it was just a lot. I do think it would be interesting to see because it was something I noticed earlier that this very deliberate choice to use a handheld shots here and there, and I would like to see if that carried on throughout, and what kind of what Park Chan-wook was going for there. So after we get this scene from the other perspective, or from Lady Hideko's perspective, where Sookee is trying to convince her to marry Count Fujiwara, and she's like, "But what if I love somebody else?" And then she slaps her because she's like, "No, marry the Count." And then Lady Hideko runs out and decides to kill herself, basically, like her aunt, like we think is what happened
her aunt
to her
aunt. Yeah.
And the movie, I had a note about this and I deleted it because I thought this was very interesting. There's a scene in part 1 when they abscond to Japan together. As they're walking out, there's a noose in the tree.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is that noose doing there?
Yeah.
And the movie doesn't comment on it at all. You just kind of see it as they're rushing off to go to Japan. And I was like, what the heck? And I had a note about it. And then it's obviously explained later on that is when Lady Hideko, again, was trying to kill herself. But then Sookee appears out of nowhere and catches her and like holds her up. And so she doesn't die. And then, so I want to know if that transpires in the book. But then also there's this moment in the movie where once they have a very brief discussion and realize that they're both playing each other and that they love each other and blah, 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 Sookee absent-mindedly lets go of her for a second. And he sits there and hangs and like suffocates for like 10 seconds before Sookee realizes and picks her back up again. And it's this is again one of those scenes is like incredibly tonally just like, what is happening here? But again, it does work. It again, because it's handled so deftly, it works very well. But it does bounce so quickly from like this horrifying, sad, and romantic, scene. I want to also preface all of this that we're gonna call a lot of things romantic at times throughout this. This is a very like toxic-ish. Like, this is, like, romantic in the way that, like, these kind of stories are romantic, but if in a real life would not really be.
I would call it romantic with a capital R.
Yes. That's, I guess, the point. I want to make it clear that, like, a relationship starting the way this relationship and playing out.
It's not ideal.
And playing out the way this relationship in the movie plays out is not, there's lots of markers of, not. She hits her at times. Like, there are very bad things going on here. But it is, again, like you said, I think romantic with a capital R.
It's not romantic like a Hallmark movie is romantic. It's romantic like a Bronte novel is romantic.
Yes, and it's not necessarily something that you should model your own sort of romantic endeavors on by any stretch. But it is more so escapist.
Yeah.
If you can acknowledge... I think it's good to be able to acknowledge the very obvious bad things going on in sort of their relationship and everything that plays out. And if you can do that, I then think it's okay to engage in it in a fun, like, idealistic like, again, it's romantic in the way that Romeo and Juliet or something, take your pick of like tragic romance.
Romantic with a capital R, as I said.
Yes, I agree. I just wanted to kind of, again, clarify that to make sure nobody was thinking that when we're done, of like, wow, their love story was so nice. It's like, it's not that simple. Just wanted to make that clear. But that doesn't happen in the book?
No, none of that is from the book.
Okay.
No, Maud never tries to kill herself.
Okay. Okie doke. Then we get the double Uno reverse, where they confess to each other. And then they sort of double agent or, double, I don't even know the word I'm looking for. Double cross, that's the word. Count Fujiwara and hatch their own plan that he thinks that he doesn't know anyways. Is that what happens in the book where they kind of...
No, that is not something that is in the book. at all.
Interesting.
You kind of think at a couple points in the novel that they might like confess to each other and join forces. You kind of hope for it, but it doesn't happen, and they both go along with the plan because they don't really know how to get out of it.
Okay, so this movie then maybe gives us a little bit of wish fulfillment thing and a little bit of maybe agency, a little bit of extra agency to those characters in determining
the
their
movie
fate.
I think is a little bit more like wish fulfillment than the book is.
Which we did talk about. I don't know if we mentioned it, but one of the things I did know that I had heard is that the ending between the book and the movie was fairly significantly different, and that the movie's ending is a slightly happier or better, or maybe not better, but like a happier.
I would call
ending.
the movie more of a traditional happy ending. Than what the book has.
Okay. Which we'll get to here. I only have a handful more questions. Upon then in that moment, Hideko decides to show Sookee kind of like what she's been through, and she shows her the library and all these books and basically what her uncle did to her when she was a kid and all that sort of thing. And then this sort of sets off Sookee, who's like, well, fuck this, and just destroys the whole library and like is destroying all the books and throwing them into they have like this like koi pond. I don't know if it's koi pond. There's like some sort of water feature
you can like move the tiles on the floor and it reveals water.
And there's like water. It's some sort of like pond thing. And when they do the readings, there's like plants and they have the water part open, and it's very cool. I don't know what it's called or anything like that, but I thought it was very neat. But she's like throwing books in there, and they're like dumping ink on the books and destroying them, and then she cuts the head off the snake with like a sword, and just destroys basically the tools of abuse that Hideko suffered under for a long time. And this is the moment where Hideko like really realizes, and it's where the intro quote that I read comes from, is from this scene about how she's her savior, and she kind of realizes how much she loves her, and then ends up joining in and helping destroy the books. Does all that transpire in the book?
It's not from the book, but I did love this scene a lot. There is a short scene just before they escape the house where Maud like sneaks and goes by herself to the library and destroys at least some of the books. It was not really clear like how much destruction she actually did, but it does not hit anywhere close to what this scene is in the movie.
The movie revels in it and really lets us enjoy it. And again, Hideko's little, like, it's a voiceover. She doesn't say it aloud, but we hear her thoughts in this moment, where she says the part at the beginning, which is, the daughter of a legendary thief who sewed winter coats out of stolen purses, herself a thief, pickpocket, swindler, the savior who came to tear my life apart, my Tamako, my Sookee. And then they run away to Japan together. With the count, blah, blah, blah. A great scene. Loved it. So now we jump back forward after Sookee has been in the asylum. We were in there very little. We see some of the bad conditions in terms of like she finds some bugs in her food and stuff like that. But we're not. This movie is not focused on that aspect of it at all. And she ultimately, there's a fire in the asylum that kind of turns out was started. At one point she writes a letter to her crime family or whatever, and they hatch a plan to get her out of this asylum, I guess. And one of her friends from there shows up and helps her sneak out in like the firefighter
And
garb.
I was wondering why at the beginning the movie went to such great lengths to show us that random kid's stutter.
Yeah.
But it's so that we knew it was him
It was
much
him
later on.
And they get her, they dress her up in the firefighter outfit, so she's like completely, it's like this big.
It's like a vintage fireman costume.
It's the 30s, so it's not. It's from the time period. I would imagine,
but it's yes,
and it's this big. It kind of looks like when you see like people like walking near volcanoes, like the big metal like.
I loved them.
Yeah, it's like that, and they like dump water on them. To help keep from burning or whatever. And anyway, so she dresses up in one of those and is then able to sneak out during this fire.
They basically just walk out.
Yeah. It's like very Ocean's 11 style escape. And I wanted to know if that's how she gets out of the asylum in the book.
No. She's in the asylum for a while in the book, and she escapes when one of the servant boys from Maud's home shows up like to visit and immediately knows that she's not Maud.
Oh, interesting.
And then agrees to help her, and he brings her like a blank key and a file so she can make a copy of the main key and get out.
I think I like the movie's
Yeah.
version. It definitely ties into her background, and I mean, especially once you make the big change where her and Hideko are working together and have like hatched this plan, and she knows. So in the book, though, when she goes into the asylum, that's not like she's not aware.
Yeah, she doesn't know that's what's happening.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the movie, they change that. Like, she plays it like she doesn't know, but she's aware. Like, they've hatched this whole plan. They know what's going on. So it's not like a big thing. But in the book, she actually is kind of taken aback in that moment. And when she's thrown in the asylum and then has to figure out how to get out.
Yeah.
Okay. I do like the movie's version of it, mainly because I do like I do like the change where they work together and swindle the evil men, but I think that works. Meanwhile, as Sookee is escaping from the asylum, Hideko is with the Count, and she has to get the money from him, and in order to do that, she decides to drug him, which he carries around opium.
Yeah.
He has like a vial of super concentrated opium, and he explains at one point that 3 drops will, knock somebody out for a day. 5 drops will like knock out a horse, and the whole bottle you'll be dead in like 10 minutes or something. And she uses that to drug him. But there's this truly terrible scene during this moment where she drugs him, but then he tries to force himself upon her, and she's like watching the time countdown on her watch before like she knows how long it should take for him to for the opium to kick in and for him to pass out, and she's like, it's a horrifying scene, and I want to know if any of that came from the book.
No, none of that is from the book.
Okay. Oof.
Yeah.
It's a rough scene.
It really is.
Very rough. But he passes out just in time, and she's able to grab all the money and get out of there. And the way he doesn't drink his wine. She actually has to like spit it into his mouth to get him to drink it, which I thought was interesting. So then they reunite. Hideko and Sookee reunite. Ultimately, we'll see what happens to them. Meanwhile, Count Fujiwara wakes up. He's not a count. He's fake count. He wakes up pantless in his hotel room, and there's these 2 guys who work for the uncle there with swords.
Yeah, they look like samurais.
Yeah, they do. I don't know if that's the implication.
I don't know if that's what
no
they're
idea. Well,
they look
and this
like,
is past the period where I don't know.
But
I don't
the
know
visual
enough.
language is there.
Definitely going for something like that. And they're the uncle's muscle, basically. Yeah. And they're there to take the Count because they've now discovered the plan. The uncle at this point has figured out that the uncle swindled him, blah, blah, blah. Or that the Count Fujiwara swindled him.
The girls absconded with the Count.
And so he brings Count Fujiwara in to torture him and that sort of thing. And he takes him down to the basement, and we get this protracted torture scene where he's like cutting off his finger. He shows him his bookmaking materials, which is like, he has like binding. He has like a big paper cutter and all this sort of stuff. And he's like cutting off fingers. It's horrifying.
Yeah, it is a very prolonged torture scene.
Yes, and then it's also we see in the background at this point that it's revealed that on top of just being like an evil, abusive nightmare person, he's also seemingly like a serial killer. Like he has, if not a serial killer, a collector of body parts from dead people. Yeah. He has all these mostly genitals of tons of all these random genitals in jars. Yeah, like on shelves all around, all around his basement torture room. And then there's anyways, and I wanted to know if that element of it, if he is like this serial killer who has like we know the basement torture chamber doesn't exist, but does he torture the Count at all, and is he implied to be like a serial killer or something?
No and no. Okay. None of that's from the book.
I also am gonna assume, because this is a really interesting thing, and really creepy and really effective, is he has this giant aquarium, and we've heard several times, there was at least one scene where he takes young Hideko down into the basement, and we hear this like sloshing and stuff, but we don't know what it is. And here it's revealed that he has this aquarium with this gigantic octopus or squid or whatever in it, which is an allusion to, throughout the course of the movie, several times we see the very famous piece of erotic art from Japan. It's like The Fisherman's Wife or something like that, where it's a woman like having coitus with an octopus, shall we say. So it's an allusion to that, but it's just like in the background writhing and terrifying. And nothing ends up happening really with it, but I wanted to know if there's a giant terrifying octopus in the book. I assume not.
There's not.
Because it without the reference to the fisherman's, it doesn't really like go anywhere.
That is pretty setting specific, yes. I would say.
Yes, absolutely. But I thought it was very, very interesting and a very good creepy touch. Which octopuses are cool. Or octopi. I think it is octopuses.
They're really cool. They're really scary.
They are very scary, or they can be, but they're very smart.
Yeah, that's part of what makes them really
I agree.
Scary.
That is what makes them scary, yes. So he tortures the Count, and he's like trying to get the Count to talk about when he had sex with Hideko and stuff. He wants all the details because, again, he's a horrifying creep. And the Count is not talking to him, but he wants to smoke a cigarette before he's like, you're going to kill me. Can I have a cigarette? And he starts smoking these blue cigarettes that he has in his cigarette case. And the room is getting more and more filled with smoke. I love he has a line. He's like, oh, no windows in here.
Yeah.
And the room is filling more and more with this smoke. And then eventually Fujiwara reveals that these cigarettes are laced with mercury. And in its gaseous state, it's very deadly. And at that point, they both croak from the mercury gas poison. And I wanted to know if anything like that happens in the book.
No, nothing like that happens in the book. I did think that scene was really interesting.
Yeah.
I have my own mini lost moment. Did they set up that the cigarettes were mercury?
They did not. From my memory, they did not set up that the cigarettes were mercury. Multiple times we see those blue cigarettes, and we don't know what they are. We do see him dose one of his cigarettes early on with opium. Okay. Like he makes a cigarette early on, and he puts a couple drops of opium on it. I remember when he made
the cigarette.
Yeah, and he puts a couple drops of opium on it, just to smoke opium or whatever. And so, but from my memory, there isn't a mention of. Okay. There may be, and I may have missed it.
Because I was confused at the end of that scene about how I didn't realize that was what was happening.
Well, yeah, you don't, again, assuming we didn't miss anything, you don't realize until he says, oh, mercury, blah, 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 whatever. Okay. But we may have missed something. There may have been, because again, this is one of those movies where it's all captions, so we're writing notes while we're watching it, and you occasionally miss things because you're looking down to type or whatever and reading your notes, and then you look back, So there may have been a line that we missed. Also, I believe the extended version of this movie has an extra 20 minutes. Maybe it's something that
Okay.
Cut. Who knows?
That's fair.
I don't know. I don't remember it being set up other than seeing the blue cigarettes and wondering what they were. Like there's a reason there got to be something. And so I assumed it was something like that or something. I assumed something was going on with those cigarettes again because he never smokes them throughout the movie and they're always in the case whenever he opens it.
Okay. It is a very interesting scene, and I think it's another scene that makes the Count's character really interesting because he is, like we said, like a gross villain.
Yes.
But also at the end, he kind of he has this moment where he's like, well, I'm going to go, but I'm taking you with me.
Yep. Yeah. And as he's right before he dies, as the Count dies, the Count had just cut his underwear off. To add another... The uncle had just cut the Count's underwear off, implication being he's about to add another thing to a jar on his wall. But the Count says in this scene as he's dying from the mercury poisoning, which I do think is it seems to me like he would have died way sooner. He's literally smoking the cigarettes. Whereas the uncle is just kind of getting secondhand. Like you would think that inhaling in mercury into your lungs would be...
Maybe he's built up a little bit of immunity to them.
There you go. Maybe. I don't know. Or maybe it's because he's much younger, he's not, whereas the uncle's pretty old and frail at this point, relatively old. I don't know. Anyways, it doesn't really matter, but I thought that was I feel like it would kill you way quicker if you're literally smoking those, but sure. But he has a line as he's dying after the uncle dies where he says, at least I'll die with my cock intact, and then he dies. And I was like, boy, this movie really isn't coy about its critique of male violence and male sexual violence. And that even in this moment, the thing that is most important to him is that his masculinity, as he sees it, is intact. And I thought that was really interesting. And I want to know if that came from the book at all.
That does not come from the book at all.
Okay. So then we cut to our happy ending. Sookee and Hideko are on their ship, sail. The Titanic. It would appear it was well after the Titanic, so it's not. But on a cruise liner sailing to, and I looked up just to figure out where they're going. They're actually going to China.
Yeah,
I think Shanghai. Maybe,
yeah, because they say like at the ticket window that they want to change the tickets to Shanghai.
Yeah, so they're going to China. But they have they're in their honeymoon suite on this boat, and they're gonna have sex, and they have these bells, which there was a reading in a book earlier where Hideko describes these two women using these. They're basically I don't know what they call them in the movie, but my understanding they're basically Benoit balls. Like if you know what, if you Google Benoit balls, they're like a thing you can buy at most of your AdamandEve.com. Adam and Eve, you want to sponsor us?
Don't Google them at work.
Don't Google them at work. It's very much a not safe for work item object. I'm just saying that's basically I think what the idea is here. But they're these bells. And she read a story about them earlier when she was forced to read the story about these women using them. And then in this scene, they use them with each other, and we hear the bells, as they have sex, and it's, yay, happy ending. And I wanted to know if the book did have a similar scene where they use these things. And it's also, these bells are similar. They harken back to that scene very early on where the uncle is punishing Hideko when she's a little girl, and he has these like metal beads, and he puts one in her mouth and then is like hitting her hand with it. Yeah. And in the scene in the end, they put them in their mouth and they put them somewhere else. And and I was wondering, basically the scene literally like the culmination of them reclaiming these tools of violence that was used against them from earlier on, these sort of symbols of patriarchal oppression and sexual violence, and reclaiming them in this very empowering way. I wanted to know if we had anything like that in the book, because I thought that was interesting.
Ish, maybe. At the end of the book, Maud is she has been writing erotica, and that's how she's been supporting herself. And then when Susan arrives there, and they kind of reconcile, she's reading to her what she's written. So I think arguably they do reclaim that erotica at the end.
I think it's just a different way of doing it. Because her writing erotica is the same.
Yeah, it's not it's kind of explicitly obvious is what the movie is.
Right. Yes, because the movie makes it very sexual.
Yeah.
Whereas the book, it's a little less but I think similarly.
But it's a similar idea.
Similarly, reclaiming that tool of oppression that was used against them. And I think it's also really interesting because I did like that it becomes clear that the movie's point isn't that erotica or pornography or sexuality are bad in any way, but that this perverted abuse of those things. That's the problem, not that, because we watch her destroy all this pornography and all this erotica, and I think a very limited reading, you could be like, well, the porn's the problem. That's what, and that's not what that's very clearly not what what the story is saying.
Yeah, it's the misuse of it.
Yeah, which I thought was interesting. And do they live happily ever after and literally sail away into the sunset having sex?
The book does end with them together, and it is implied that they're going to be happy, but they aren't literally sailing away from their problems.
Okay, interesting. I assumed when I had heard that the movie had a happier ending than the book, or that they changed the ending, and I assumed that they didn't end up together or something.
But it takes much longer for them to get to that point in the book, but they do reconcile at the end.
Okay, cool. All right. Those are all of my questions. It's time now to find out what Katie thought was better in the book.
You like to read?
Oh, yes. I love to read.
What do you like to read?
Everything.
All right. Some details from the book that didn't make it into the movie. There's a scene very early on where they're teaching Sue how to be a lady's maid, and they teach her how to dress a lady, because a lady wears corsets and crinolines and all of this stuff.
Many layers.
Normal girls don't wear. And they teach her how to do that by dressing a chair in the kitchen.
Oh.
Which I thought could have made for a fun scene.
Yeah, that would have been fun.
When she's on the train like journeying out to the English countryside.
Is there a great sorry real quick, was there a line later where Sue is dressing the lady and she goes, "This is much easier on a chair," or something like that?
No, but there is
a
a line later when Maud ends up at Sue's former home, and one of the other people there is like, "I liked you better when you were a chair."
Ah, okay. I was like, if you're gonna do that setup, there's got to be at least one callback joke to it. There had to be. Okay,
Yeah.
as long as they had one. All right.
So when Sue is on the train journeying out to meet Maud at Briar House, there's a crying baby, and it's set up earlier, and we get a similar illusion. I have this in another segment to them like dosing the babies with alcohol.
Yeah, they give them spoonfuls of sake in the movie.
It's gin in the book.
Right.
But there's a crying baby on the train, and Susan very naively says like, "Ain't you got any gin?" And the mother of the baby is like, "What?
Pardon me,
Excuse me."
That's funny.
So this is an actual change, not just something that was left out. In the movie, we see them both like peeking through the door that connects their rooms. Like we see Sookee peeking through, and then later on we see that Lady Hideko was actually like on the other side, and then she also peeks through.
Yeah, Lady Hideko specifically seems to have some sort of peephole in the wall specifically.
So they which, and like that's fine. I liked that in the movie.
Yeah.
One thing that I thought was interesting in the book though is that in that scene, Sue like puts her ear up to the door to try to hear through it. And then when we switch to Maud's perspective, we find out that at that same moment, she also had her ear to the door.
Yeah, that would have been a nice little moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I could see it visually.
Yes.
So I was kind of expecting that to happen.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
There's a scene in the book where Sue teaches Maud to dance. They have dancing lessons. Because she's worried about going to be a lady in London and not knowing how to dance, or she's at least pretending to be worried about that.
Yeah. That would have been a fun scene.
Sue also reads her fortune from like playing cards, like she's reading tarot, which was a fun scene. One thing that I thought was kind of funny is that in part one, while we're in Sue's perspective, she thinks she's doing a really great job of pretending to be a maid and like having better manners than what she does.
Yeah.
But when we get in Maud's perspective, we find out that she's actually kind of a terrible actress and is not doing a very good job.
Yeah. Maud is like very clearly aware. Yeah.
And also what we see in Maud's perspective, that Sue is kind of a manic pixie dream girl. She kind of like blows into Maud's bleak home situation and is like, "I'm here to be let's go on adventures. I am spirited and fun."
That definitely doesn't translate as much.
Yeah.
I wouldn't get that. I don't get that vibe. I mean, there's a little bit of that in the movie, like very much like at least the way that Hideko is playing her role. Whereas, where Sookee comes in and is showing her the ways of the world and that sort of stuff and seemingly much more, worldly. But it's not the same kind of like, I wouldn't call her a manic pixie dream girl by any stretch.
Which, I mean, that's not wholly accurate to the manic pixie dream girl trope, but it is like, I got that kind of vibe and I thought it was a little bit fun. It's a different use of the manic pixie dream girl, I think. We find out in the book that we see all of Maud's backstory similarly to how we do for Lady Hideko in the movie. And she actually lived in the madhouse when she was very young. Because, like, she's sent there along with her mother as a baby. And she initially thinks she was born there, which we find out later is not true. But she lives there until she's, like, 10. And then her uncle, like, sends people to fetch her.
Interesting.
Another thing that we get in the book is Maud has a lot of like obvious trauma markers. Like she has like some kind of OCD type like routines and behaviors. Like she has like a very elaborate rituals that she does before bed, so that she'll be safe throughout the night. There are like bits here and there where she's like, if I step only in these certain places, then I'll make it safely up the stairs. But I thought it was a really interesting characterization of someone who's been through the kind of trauma that she has.
Yeah, I don't think the movie really gives us anything like that. I mean, we get these moments of like sort of nightmares and stuff, seemingly nightmares for. Again, it's then implied later that those are fake, or at least to some extent when we see it from Hideko's perspective. But at least initially, there's an implication that she. But I think that would have been nice or interesting to see potentially, depending on how it was depicted.
So there's this moment in the book. So her uncle, whom we have established is a lecherous creep.
Oh, just the worst.
Yeah, just the worst. And he has a line where he's talking to like some of his gentleman friends, and we've established earlier that he doesn't like Catholics, or papists as he calls them.
They call them, yeah.
And he has a line where he says, "I defy you to name me any institution so nurturing of the atrocious acts of lechery as the Catholic Church of Rome." And I kind of loved this acknowledgement of the fact that this type of person that the uncle is, that type of person never thinks that they're a villain.
No,
never.
No,
so when you can, so they can acknowledge something like the sexual abuse committed by the Catholic Church,
right? And
that's like, but they don't like clock that like, oh, that's also me.
Yes, that's me too. Yeah, yeah.
So when they lock Sue up in the asylum,
or I think another way to look at it too is, even if they do recognize it, it's projection. You foist those things onto the people you detest. I mean, it's just, how many times do you see the people most objecting to whatever, pick your vice, in society tend to be guilty of indulging in said vice, and I'm using vice very broadly here and very finger quotey vice. I think it's very common that sort of projection by people doing the things that they're most adamantly arguing against.
So the two girls, even as they are kind of like plotting against each other, they both keep mementos. Maud keeps the sewing thimble that Sue used to file down her tooth, and Sue keeps one of her gloves. One of Maud's gloves. When they lock Sue up in the asylum, they've passed her off as being Maud, the lady.
Yeah.
And the reason for her malady. So they've concocted this story for the doctors, basically, that she has. Okay, how do I explain this? Because it's very like twisty-turny.
Yeah.
So they've concocted this story that Susan is Lady Maud, but that she has given over to this delusion that she's a lady's maid instead of being the lady.
I think that's the movie's same implication.
Yeah, I think that is the same implication.
Because when they have. In the movie, they have Sookee talk to the people from the asylum, and she's telling the people from the asylum that Hideko, thinks she's. Anyways,
yeah.
I think it's the same implication in the movie, is that she's deluded herself into thinking she's a handmaiden, but actually she's lady, the lady, and yeah.
So the reason then that the doctor comes up with for her madness, which I believe is actually something that was a real belief at the time, was that she had been overexposed to literature. And therefore her feeble female mind had invented this fiction.
Yeah.
because she'd been overexposed to books.
Obviously. Women's dumb little minds can't handle that. It breaks them. Yeah.
There's a scene when Maud is being held at Susan's former home where she actually escapes, but she can't get anyone to help her. Like, she goes to this former colleague of her uncle's and is like, please help me. And he like won't be associated with her because it's all so scandalous. And so she ends up having no choice but to go back to the house, which I thought was a really good exploration of one of the book's themes of like exploring how few options women had in this time and place, and how like at the whim of the men in their lives they were. Yeah,
absolutely.
And on a similar note, we spend a lot of time with Susan at the asylum, and it is fucking brutal. I won't go into detail, but it's fucking brutal.
Yeah. Imagine how, mental institutions and whatnot are still not great in a lot of places. And were even worse just, 30 or 40 years ago. Imagine that 100 years ago, or well, I guess in this instance, 150 years ago or something like that. When Victorian era is like 1850s, so 150-ish years ago. It's absolutely a nightmare. All right. Time now to find out what Katie thought was better in the movie.
My life has taught me one lesson, Hugo, and not the one I thought it would. Happy endings only happen in the movies.
The book does give us both of their perspectives, as I've said, but the storyline runs a little more or less in a linear fashion. We do jump back and see some stuff again from Maud's perspective, but it's more or less linear. And I enjoyed that the movie jumped around a little bit more. I especially liked the false start before you know that Sookee isn't actually a handmaiden.
Yeah, it was just an extra layer of
an extra layer of interest. And something that, like, if you hadn't read the book and weren't familiar with the source material, you wouldn't know that there was a twist coming.
Yeah.
I liked also in that initial scene, Lady Hideko screaming and running with the blanket over her head.
Particularly the shot, the way it's shot. We're outside looking through the windows, and she just comes streaking through the windows in the background. It's very funny. Yeah.
I liked the hidden drawer under the stairs at the house. When the Count is explaining what his plot is, because the book does mention that there are little like hiding spots all over the house.
Yeah, they have like a false
because they basically aside from the infant farm, they also run like a pawn shop for stolen goods. So there's hiding places everywhere. But I enjoyed actually seeing one of the hiding places because the book doesn't go into a ton of detail about that.
That was a fun little moment.
And I love anything hidden.
Yes, always fun.
Hide something in another thing that doesn't look like it's hiding anything. I love that.
Delightful.
I liked the scene where Sookee keeps opening drawers full of gloves. Which, and the gloves are much more of a thematic element in the book than they are in the movie, I would say.
They show up a lot in the movie, though, I will say, because there's a constant recurring thing with all of our villains wear black gloves a lot.
Yeah.
Or maybe not our villains necessarily, because the aunt wears them, I think, quite a bit. Hideko's aunt, and she's not really a villain, she's a victim. But
well, and Hideko wears them specifically when she's like reading and handling
the black gloves are constantly in connection with the abuse. And the
In the book, I would say it's much more of a thing that is an indicator of the trauma she's suffered. Like there's a whole thing about like she doesn't like to take off her gloves.
Right. She
even sleeps in her gloves.
Yeah, I think the movie did avoid or did not do that.
I don't think the movie got into that so much. Yeah. But initially, before I knew how much the story was going to divulge to, I was like, okay, I like that, showing just drawer after drawer of gloves.
We do see a lot of gloves.
Yes.
And she does wear gloves a lot because, like, it's like maybe
she's
less
also a lady.
Yes, but like there's that one the thing I'm thinking of, and maybe she is wearing them like all the time, and it's just not really remarked upon because I specifically remember one scene, the scene on the wedding night when her and Fujiwara are in Japan and after their wedding. And they need to make a show of it, and so Hideko like masturbates. We see her take her gloves off, like she gets undressed, but she's still wearing her gloves, and then she takes her gloves off and sets them down.
They're not absent from the movie.
Right.
I just don't think that the movie uses them in the same way or quite as much as the book does.
Yeah, and like it definitely doesn't draw a bunch of specific attention to it, and it's one of those things you notice, but it's definitely not ever remarked upon or made a point of, I would say.
They're on the cover of the book.
Yes.
Look at these gloves.
Look at those gloves.
I thought the scene where Sookee was going through her stuff at the beginning, there's a similar scene in the book, but I thought it was funnier and more interesting in the movie. I enjoyed that tonal shift.
Like putting on the hat and everything.
Yeah, like putting on the hat and stuff. And just like digging through the boxes and not knowing what things are or what they're for. The grounds at the house in the movie, beautiful.
Oh God!
The
whole movie is gorgeous.
The whole movie is beautiful.
But yeah.
And the equivalent place, Maud's estate in the book, is described as like incredibly bleak. Like it's always raining there. The house is like kind of moldy and falling into disrepair.
Yeah.
And I totally get the symbolism. 100% understand the symbolism. But I'm glad that we got to look at something lush and green.
I also think it's almost more. I mean, I get the symbolism, but I also think there's something even more interesting symbolically about this horrifying underbelly of this abuse going on in a beautiful place, as opposed to like you expect horrible things to be happening in a dilapidated, moldy old. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like. It feels
the house, the estate in the book is very much like Bronte novel, like kind of a thing.
And I think the contrast of this idyllic, beautiful scenery versus the cruel, awful things happening there, I think is maybe more interesting.
I liked that a couple scenes after the tooth filing bath scene, we see that Sookee is still wearing the thimble on her finger.
Very cute.
I liked the little moment where Hideko walks into the dining room and the Count jumps up and like knocks his chair over, like this very exaggerated
very
motion.
Clearly intentionally.
Yeah, but I thought it was funny.
Yeah.
I also liked Suki's nervous giggling while they're like walking together in the garden. She has a very nervous
laugh, like very high, like a very unguarded, like unrefined laugh that is very endearing.
The scene, oh my God, the scene where Sookee sees Hideko and the Count kissing. What she thinks is them like making out.
Yeah.
And they're out in the forest on the grounds and like they're on a rock and then she stands up and like the sun is hitting
like coming
and her hair is blowing and her blue dress against the deep green leaves and my God,
everything
the tableau.
I'll talk more about it later because I have some specific notes, but this is such a gorgeous film, and some of the shots they crafted for this film are just exquisite in ways that is hard to overstate.
This is a little thing, but I thought it was so interesting. The reveal that the housekeeper at the estate was the uncle's first wife.
I did not even realize that was the reveal.
Yeah, it's like a little moment where I think the Count just says like, oh, but she was your first wife, wasn't she?
Yeah.
That he like abandoned because he wanted to marry a Japanese woman because he wants to be Japanese.
Yes, because and that's a whole added layers. Yeah, he's Korean, but he basically sold out the Koreans to he worked with the Japanese basically to help them, when they came in and started occupying, and he's basically like a traitor essentially.
I thought having the switch at the asylum be Hideko's idea was an interesting twist. Now, obviously, it wouldn't work with the book's version of things, where like literally everything was plotted out from the very start.
Yeah.
But I did think it was interesting.
Yeah, I liked it.
I thought the Count smoking 3 cigarettes on the drive back to the house.
Very good.
And don't misunderstand me. He did not smoke 3 cigarettes in a row.
No.
He pulled 3 out of the case and put them all in his mouth.
Yes. It's actually great too, because it's doing 2 things which you don't even necessarily realize at the time.
Yeah.
In the moment, it's just a very funny scene. He knows.
Yeah, he knows
what's going on, and he's just like, oh, fuck it. And so he smokes 3 cigarettes. But also, there's a very practical effect there, is that he's getting rid of his other cigarettes so that later on, when he asks for a cigarette, the only ones,
the only ones left are the mercury ones.
The mercury ones, whereas if he had the other ones there and he gives him one, he goes, no, give me one of the other ones.
And it also shows that to us again.
Yes.
So
it reminds us
see
that
the
there
blue
are these other
cigarettes.
cigarettes, yeah.
And I liked that they disguised Hideko as a man to leave the country.
Is it not in the book?
No.
Yeah, that was interesting.
They did a good job, too.
Yeah, very good.
That mustache looked great.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. All right, we got a handful of things that the movie nailed.
As I expected, practically perfect in every way.
All the babies we talked about and giving them alcohol to make them sleep.
Yep.
The initial conceit, pretty much the same, except for some of the details about like the uncle and his history. Sookee/Sue is not able to read. That was also something from the book. All the servants at the house are taken with gentleman/the Count. They think he's super great.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's a very handsome man.
Yeah, they're like very taken in by him. Very charming.
I will say, I don't know if they did anything in the editing process to his voice, but his voice is so rich and like
like butter.
Yeah, it's just so, and to me, it feels like they tweaked it slightly in post just to give it a little extra oomph to really kind of sell him as this. I don't know.
The cover for the Count and Hideko spending time together is in both the book and the movie, like that he's giving her painting and drawing lessons, and then she's really bad at it.
Yes.
Everything she makes is really bad.
Yeah, but he lies and it's like, that's great.
Yeah.
You see the essence of the object.
Sue in the book does think that her mother was hanged as a criminal. Which is the backstory that Sookee gives in the movie, which I guess in the movie that could have actually been true.
I think it's actually supposed to have been true.
Which we find out in the book that that's a fabrication.
Right.
But
I think in the movie they just changed it to that actually being what happened.
They do abscond in the night, and they escape by river in a boat. The blood on the sheets after the wedding night.
Yeah.
We see them, and then it's revealed later. From another perspective to have been from a cut and not from her losing her virginity. We see the uncle beating her hands with beads on a rope, we mentioned, and that is something from the book. He does do that. Okay. He doesn't put one of them in her mouth.
Okay.
But he has like beads covered in silk on a rope that he beats her hands with.
Yeah. Well, and the movie obviously adds the part where he puts it in her mouth.
Yeah.
For the end of the movie for that thematic through line. So, alrighty, we got a handful of odds and ends before we get to the final verdict.
I love Lady Hideko's hair so much.
Yes.
Her hair always looked really cool.
Yeah. And she has lots of great outfits throughout the movie.
She does,
just tons of really cool.
Really if you're into costumes and hair and that kind of thing, this is would be a delight for you.
I think it won quite a few awards for costuming when it did the award circuit. Not in America, but it won awards like in Britain, all over the place. And for whatever reason, I just didn't.
And I
make
especially
it to the US.
too, like I thought the mix of like Western and Eastern styles was really interesting.
Well, because you're hitting that time period, it's 1930s where the Western world is that you're clashing in much more of a much more prominent way where you know, we're past the Industrial Revolution. Round the world travel is not, you know, as nearly as difficult as it was before. So lots of things are making their ways. And obviously also we have the part of that is represented with the colonial rule of Japan and sort of the style and their, like the clashing of those different things, which is all really interesting. I loved her one hat when they escape. That outfit when they leave for Japan, and she's got that giant hat on. It's so cool. Anyway,
something about, I think it was like the outdoor scenes made me think of 2005 Pride and Prejudice, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why.
There's focuses on hands and touching.
Yeah.
I mean, we get a very explicit lingering shot of them holding hands on the boat when they're when they do run off to Japan. They like holding hands with each other, and because of the gloves and stuff. And it's also and I'll talk about it. I guess my the use of sound reminded me at times of, I mean, it's a period piece, obviously.
Right. So you're gonna see you
get a lot of similarities with that kind of
filmmaking tropes.
But one of the things that I thought was really interesting is the use of sound in the film, especially in the first part. In part one, there's so many moments that are, it's just so subtle, like especially when they're like the bath scene, the dressing scenes where there's no music. It's just it's like ASMR basically. But it lingers and it's super subtle, and it's just all of these little sounds, you know, of clothes being moved and all of these different things it's a very and it evokes a very, I don't know, erotic sort of auditory experience without being explicit in any way. It's just, again, it's kind of like ASMR in that regard, where it's just like these little, like very subtle sound design moments based on it's like fabric and cloth and buttons and So the movie is also we talked about how gorgeous it is. But there's also early on, some of the camera moves reminded me of Amelie a little bit, in sort of the frenetic way the camera kind of does these big swinging, sweeping shots and stuff. It's not identical by any stretch, and Amelie does some different things. But there's one shot in particular reminded me of a moment from, not a specific moment from Amelie, but was the moment that reminded me of some of the cinematography in Amelie. And it's when Count Fujiwara comes in and is explaining his plan, and he's like standing at the fireplace, and the camera's on one side of him, and he's talking about needing somebody to come be the handmaiden, and he's talking, and the one girl volunteers that's not Sookee or whatever, and then he's like, no, you're I don't know, he says no or whatever, and then the camera swings around him and reveals Sookee on the other side. A handful of shots like that. The way the camera moves reminded me of Amelie a little bit. And then there's this one shot that everything about it I love so much. It's shot through a window, and I love because partially you can't figure out what you're looking at first, or what, at least it took me a second to figure out what I was looking at. Where it's shooting through a window, and it's right after, I believe it's when Sookee sees them kissing, and then she's coming back to the house or whatever. Or maybe it's a slightly different sign, but it's raining, and Suki's walking back to the house, and we're shooting through a window, and there's the window has sections, and part of it's frosted or something. Yeah. And so it's split right down the middle of the frame, and in the top and bottom half, and you see her in the distance walking, and then she walks up and walks past the window, and then puts her face into the side of the window. Everything about that shot was so much of the cinematography in this film. Again, it reminded me a little bit of Parasite, where it's just very inspiring. It just lots of ideas. It's just I gotta remember all of these things to use and things, because it's just all so cool.
I don't know if this is something that would have been commonplace in this time and in this country. But it really amused me that it seems like they got her inheritance just in cash.
I don't believe so. So I think because one of the things they talk about during that is how it's taking him so long to get it converted to cash.
Oh, okay.
He's going to do something where he's like,
he just like showed up with a suitcase of cash, and I was like, all right, I guess.
There's like a line or an implication that part of the reason they're there for like a week or two, and during that time he is doing something to get the inheritance into cash form. That they can take.
That makes more sense.
Is what it felt like to me. I could be wrong about that, but that's what it seemed like to me. When they do get to Japan, there's that shot, and I saw this I watched like a little 5-minute like making of documentary, and this was one of the shots they showed. But that is this wide shot of them walking up
the giant staircase,
this giant staircase in the woods, and then just when they get to Japan, all the woods there, and oh my god, it's so fucking beautiful. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. The Count's death scene is also amazing. We talked a little bit about it, but the way the editing in that scene is so fucking good. It's and the editing in the whole movie is great, but there's so many little subtleties in that scene when the Count dies. Where his breathing is mixed slightly above everything else. Like you can hear him breathing. And then also we've had this recurring thing throughout the movie where they've talked about how because they have power, but it's like they're one of the few people that have power because of the occupation or whatever. And so every now and then they have like rolling blackouts and like the lights will like flicker and go out. And as he's like dying, we're hearing him breathing and then the lights start flickering. And then it cuts to Hideko on the boat. Yeah. And it's the scene, and it's like his memory of that moment when they were going to Japan together. And then like in the background, Hideko and Sookee are holding hands, and then like it gets this weird like blurry, there's this effect applied to the scene again as he's sort of like dying, I assume. And it felt like a very realistic sort of film portrayal of death. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, this is very interesting.
Yeah, super well done. And then it just kind of fades out, and then we just move on. I don't know. Everything about that scene I thought was just incredible.
I had one of those moments at the very end of this movie when they're sailing off into the sunset where I was like, this is so nice. They ended up together. They're going to go be happy. They're sailing away together. And then I was like, oh no, they're going to go live in China right before the Second World War. Yeah. This is terrible.
I don't know what China's involvement was in the Second World War. Or like
I believe, and now again, this is not an area of expertise for me, but I believe that China during the Second World War was like very much under siege from Japan.
That
like in a lot of like
to me,
atrocities
but I don't know.
Committed.
It sounds correct to me, but I'm not aware. I'm also not a World War II scholar, so I do not know. But maybe they moved on from there and got somewhere safe. Which again, World War II, not a whole lot of places. Maybe
not a whole lot of places.
Maybe they made their way to like Australia or something. I feel like that was like the only one of the few places where things weren't terrible.
Which, and I mean, they had money, so they might have been okay.
Yeah,
but
who knows? Yeah. Also, I mean, they're also, for the time period, they're women. It's not like they're going to get
right. They're not getting drafted into,
yeah, yeah. Not that there wasn't a million other horrible things that could happen, but yeah. All right, before we get to the final verdict, we wanted to remind you that you can do us a giant favor by heading over to patreon.com/thisfilmislit. Support us there for $2, $5, or $15 a month to get different access to different things at each level. And at the $15 level, you get access to patron requests, where if you support us for $15 a month, you can request a movie/book for us to do, and it will go on to it'll be like priority recommendation status. We don't do it immediately. We have a long list of patron requests and our own stuff, so it'll go on there, and it'll be a while, but we will do it eventually. And this one was a patron request from Ben Wilcox. So Ben Wilcox, thank you for supporting us, and thank you for recommending this movie/book. Also, you can do us a giant favor by following us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Goodreads, all the social media platforms. We post all kinds of stuff there, including our follow-up, like our fan polls, where you can comment and tell us what you thought about the book, what you thought about the movie, what you liked, what you didn't like, what you thought about our episode, our discussions, all that sort of stuff. And then we read that feedback in our prequel episodes and discuss what you had to say about the movie and the book. So go follow us on those platforms and engage with us. All right, Katie, it's time for the final verdict.
Now, are you ready for your sentence?
Sentence? But there must be a verdict first.
Sentence first, verdict afterward.
There was something you mentioned in the prequel that confused me for the first half or so of the movie. You said that the author of the book said that the film was more accurately inspired by her novel rather than based on it.
Yes, that was one of my fun facts, yeah.
And that really confused me up to a certain point in the film because, like, aside from the obvious differences to the setting and the story structure, they're really quite similar. And the film diverges from the novel by having its two lead characters confess their duplicity and join forces. And from there out, the book and the movie are very different. The novel and the film also differ slightly in how they explore male violence towards women. Now, the film focuses on that violence, I think, in a more literal and I would say arguably more sexual sense. The novel only implies that Maud's uncle may have been physically sexually abusive of her, while the film explicitly shows that he is. The film also includes the Count's attempted rape of Hideko, not something that ever happens in the book. In fact, I actually thought in the book there might be a reveal that he was gay because he showed so little interest in having sex with her.
Which is something similar in the movie, but it's implied.
Yeah.
But he is in the movie. He does ultimately say I do love you. Like he does kind of become.
But he doesn't ever express any kind of interest or infatuation with her. Yeah. And I also I say a reveal to be gay because it felt like it fit with the book's overall vibe and setting.
Right.
We didn't actually get that reveal, so it's kind of moot. Yeah. But anyway. The novel, I think, more expansively focuses on what it meant to be a woman during a specific time and place. It goes to great lengths to show how few options and resources each girl has, how they're forced to be dependent on the men in their lives and can really only hope for kindness, and how their independence and autonomy can be snatched away at a whim. The film acknowledges those issues, I think, but ultimately sees the two girls figure out how to escape them. The novel is incredibly long and dense and really submerges itself within its setting. And aside from the brutal pace at which I forced myself to read it, I really enjoyed it. I also wholeheartedly enjoyed the movie. And despite very much liking the route that the book took, I also very much liked the way that the film diverged from that path. In choosing a victor, the rub for me is that the things I liked about the book wouldn't work with the direction that the film takes, and the things I liked about the film wouldn't work with the direction that the book takes. I always feel like it's a bit of a cop-out to do this, but sometimes it's just true. I have to call this one a draw.
There you go. And I think that's fair in instances, particularly in instances where they are so different, where they're doing such different things.
Yes, and that's really it.
And different things well. Unlike I Am Legend, where it changes things drastically, but it does it very much for the worse. This one just makes its own changes in a way that you also really
and I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a difference between the two mediums just being different and the fact that they are doing incredibly different things.
Yeah. Yeah, because that is something we talk about too.
That makes it harder to do a one-to-one comparison.
Yeah. It's always hard because there are things we talk about where it's like, oh, obviously you would change these things for a movie because it just doesn't work as well in a movie. Where that's not necessarily what you're talking about in this instance. You're talking about more here, it feels like, to me at least, just changes in the story in general, not so much because it's a film, but just because they wanted to do a different.
Yeah, they're telling a different story, essentially.
And both of those stories work really well, so it is hard thus to then pick one. Interesting. All right. Before we wrap up, we wanted to give you a little preview of what we have coming up next. Katie, what's next?
Up next, we will be talking about Slapstick, which is a novel by Kurt Vonnegut.
It's our first Vonnegut.
Yeah. And as also its 1982 film adaptation, Slapstick of Another Kind. which apparently is notoriously bad.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. I know literally nothing about.
I had never heard of either.
I had never heard of either of these, and I did not. Once you told me the names of them, I hadn't looked anything up, and I did not realize it was Kurt Vonnegut. So I'd be very interested.
Yeah,
I
don't think it's one of his more like well-known novels.
I mean, definitely not one of the couple really well-known novels, but yeah, interesting. All right. Well, we'll check that out. We'll have a prequel episode on that in 1 week, and then in 2 weeks we're talking about Slapstick of Another Kind. Until that time, guys, gals, non-binary pals, everybody else,
keep reading books,
keep watching movies,
and keep being awesome.